people a moment. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to JWA's Book Talks. My name is Judith Rosenbaum. I'm the CEO of the Jewish Women's Archive. I'm so happy to be back with you for tonight for the third session of our Fall Book Talk series. Happy Sukkot. Hope you're enjoying the holiday. Please, as always, say hello in the chat. We'd love to know who is with us in the room. Make sure you're chatting to everyone so we can all see who you are and where you are. And please also put your questions throughout our conversation into the chat box, and we'll try to bring them in our conversation. Just a brief logistical note, if you would like captioning, you can click on the bottom of the screen on the button that says CC or show captions, and that will turn the captions on for you. We can't turn them on for you, so you'll have to click that. A few words about JWA for anyone who is new to us. We are a digital archive. We work to expand and transform the way that we understand history and Jewish culture by documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories. We also pay special attention to how gender functions in both the past and the present. And we do this work because we believe that uncovering a more diverse and nuanced story helps us create a better world. So thank you for being our partners in that work. This book talks and all of our virtual programs are just one part of the work that we do. So we hope that you will check out jwa.org to explore the full range of projects and resources that we offer. Tonight's session is a very special book talk because it is the first event in our celebration of the 10th anniversary of the Rising Voices Fellowship, which is our writing fellowship for teens interested in feminism, Judaism, and social justice. So first of all, mazel tov to all of us. We've got a wonderful new generation of feminist leaders coming up, and we are so honored to get to work with them. Given our focus tonight on young women's leadership, I would like to introduce my colleague, Sarah Biskowitz, who will moderate the conversation tonight. Sarah is the manager of the Rising Voices Fellowship, and she is also an alumna herself from the 2016-2017 cohort. Before working at JWA, she just joined us this summer, Sarah studied at the Pardes Institute of Jewish Studies and served as a fellow at the Yiddish Book Center. She's a graduate of Smith College, and she has spoken and written about feminist Yiddish culture, and we are so happy to have her on our team. And I will also introduce, and I'm delighted to do so, our featured author for tonight, Mattie Kahn, the author of Young and Restless, The Girls Who Sparked America's Revolutions, which is wonderful, and you should all buy it and read it. Mattie is an award-winning writer and editor. Her work has been published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, Harper's Bazaar, Vogue, Vox, many more. She was the culture editor at Glamour, and she covered women's issues and politics and was a staff editor at Elle. She lives in New York and joins us from there today. And Sarah, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Judith. It's my pleasure to be moderating this talk with Mattie. And first, I'd like to say a few words about the Rising Voices Fellowship. Founded in 2013, the Rising Voices Fellowship is a 10-month program for Jewish 10th through 12th grade students looking to participate in a community that centers the experience of Jewish women. Through the program, participants develop authentic voices, strengthen their leadership through writing, and begin to influence the important conversations of Jewish and feminist communities. I myself participated in this program, as Judith said, almost 8 years ago, and am thrilled to be managing it now. The alum community of RVF is nearly 150 members strong, and this year we are celebrating our 10th anniversary year through special events and blog posts. And what better way to kick off this anniversary year than a discussion of a book about young women activists? So thanks so much for being with here, Mattie. I have some questions prepared, and I will also try to incorporate the questions from the chat as well. Great. So Mattie, thank you. So in this book, you highlight a diverse array of girls throughout American history. I'm wondering if you can discuss some of the Jewish girls and women who appear in your book.
Yes, it was funny. As I was sitting here, as we were getting ready to begin, I was like, I bet I know one question I'm going to be asked tonight. So I'm glad we're starting there. First of all, thank you to everyone who's here and from so many different places. Very thrilling. Yeah, so I would say, first of all, there are plenty of Jewish young women in the book. Certainly, I think a lot of people know that in the labor movement that was, springing up in the early 20th century, young Jewish women were on the front lines of that movement and certainly appear in the book. And then also in a kind of a full circle moment, the climate change movement, which is a version of the labor movement for our time, I think, since it is so focused on people's ability to live and work on this planet, is also suffused with Jewish identity and Jewish young women. Jamie Margolin, who appears in sort of in the later chapters of the book, talks about her Jewish identity and as one of the animating forces of her life and her understanding of the world. But I would also say that for me as a Jewish author, the book is a reflection of the kinds of things that my Jewish education and upbringing taught me to be sensitive to. Who are the people who are sort of rattling for change? Who are the people who are willing to take risks to make progress as a society? They don't all have to be Jewish, and certainly not all the young women in the book are, but I feel like my point of view was a big factor in how I structured the book, how I thought of whose voices we lift up, who we hear from. So I think that in many of these movements, certainly labor and climate change come immediately to mind. And of course, women's suffrage, which is full of rabble-rousing Jewish women. There are plenty, but I think for me too, as the author, thinking about my own Jewish identity was a big factor in, you know, of all the things one can choose to write a book about, I wanted to write about young women agitating for change.
Thank you. Speaking of labor and suffrage, there's actually one instance you describe in the book of a march that was taking place on a Saturday, and this kind of discussion of Jewish activists about the timing of the march and the observance of Shabbat. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that moment in history.
Yeah, totally. So Harriet Stanton Blatch was sort of the preeminent organizer of this particular march that was going to rally tens of thousands of people in New York, and it was going to take place on a Saturday. And it was March for Suffrage, but the suffrage movement drew so heavily from labor activists, and Jewish women, as we were saying, were on the front lines of the labor movement in New York. So Harriet was very intent that the march start before sundown because she wanted the photos to look really good for the next day's paper. And the Jewish women wanted the march to start after sundown because, of course, some of them were celebrating Shabbat and did not want to be marching in the streets on a Saturday. In the end, they compromised and the start time got pushed so that the end of the march would take place after sundown. And Harriet got her way because the beginning was still sufficiently before that photographers could take pictures and it would make the next day's paper. But it was, of course, like that is a perfect example, I will say, inside scoop for the people that are in this video call. That's exactly the kind of thing that a lovely editor, including mine, who's amazing, whom I adore, was like, do we need this story? And I was like, we're keeping this story in. And that's when you can really tell that it's a Kahn who wrote this book and not just anybody. I love that story. And I'm glad you pointed it out.
Yeah, I definitely appreciated it. So I'm glad you kept it in. But of course, you couldn't cover everything. So I'm wondering if you could talk about the process of making those hard choices of what to include and what you had to cut.
Yes, the book was like almost a full extra quarter longer in its first draft. And even that would not have been sufficient to tell all the stories that I could have told in a book like this. I think one thing that really helped me winnow it down, and I didn't think of it as a parameter at the time, but I have come to see that it was a helpful way of just deciding what did and didn't belong, is that I sort of had this informal rule for myself that I was going to try really hard not to write about girls who had no voice in the archive, girls I couldn't quote directly, girls about whom only things had been written, but we didn't know anything about how they themselves had felt or what they said, speeches they gave, letters that we still had. I did that because honestly, as like a protective instinct, I didn't want to tell stories where I felt like I could easily be getting it wrong. Now, of course, when you're writing history, you can always get it wrong. That's one of the daunting things about it. But I felt like, okay, at least if I make a rule that I'm going to quote girls who have spoken for themselves, I can at least incorporate the way they saw some of these issues, the way they viewed their own lives contemporaneously. That was helpful because sadly, there are tons of girls about whom we know almost nothing except for their names or something somebody else said about them. You know, there are girls whose names I put in the book who I don't quote from directly, but anyone that I'm talking about at length is someone whose letters I read, whose diaries I read, or, you know, who wrote op-eds or gave speeches that we know a lot about. And that narrowed it down considerably because there are so many gaps in the archive and places where one wishes that there was more to hear from the girls themselves. So that was one kind of sad way. I think the more positive way is that I wanted to choose girls that I felt could tell us something about both girlhood and activism. So there have been amazing and incredible activists of all kinds. But I wanted to choose stories that felt like they exemplified something about these movements that were coming into view in America, and something about what makes girls, which is part of the thesis of the book, such good activists. So it wasn't enough to just be an incredible activist, although kudos to all of those people. I wanted to tell the stories of girls that I felt like were there at the beginning of social change and who used some element of being a young woman to further whatever their particular cause for justice was. I will say there was one point where there was an entire additional chapter in the book about this kind of band of evangelical girl crusaders that lived and preached in the 1910s and 20s and were kind of like the Taylor Swifts of their day, selling out literally Madison Square Garden. And my editor kindly and gently said, I don't really think this belongs in this book, but I did find them riveting, and I highly recommend reading about them if you're ever as interested in these pint-sized preachers as I was for a time.
That sounds very interesting. I don't think we have any information on the Jewish Women's Archive about them.
No, they're in a separate category for sure.
That's great. Can you tell us more about what your research process was like in these archives and writing this book?
Yeah, it was, I mean, the research happened at this unique time because I started doing the research for the book probably around 2018-ish. So I had 2 years of basic research where I was pulling together, actually kind of more testing my own theories, thinking, I think there are these interesting stories about young women, but are there enough? And during that time, I wasn't deeply in the archives, but I was certainly surveying what was available in libraries in New York and getting to do in-person research. And then I sold the book in 2020. And so the opportunities for in-person research quickly dried up. On the one hand, that was very annoying and kind of devastating, because anyone who has ever been in the archives knows that the best stuff that you find is stuff you find by accident. On the other hand, I became acquainted with many lovely librarians across the country who had very little to do but go spelunking in the archives looking for amazing source material for me, scanning it and sending it to me because it was the summer of 2020 and nobody was going anywhere. So in some ways, I had this very bespoke research process that, should I ever do a project like this again, will not be replicated, because these amazing academics and librarians had truly nothing but time. So there was a lot of email correspondence in this archival work, a lot of, writing to people at, for example, the Schlesinger Library in Cambridge that houses incredible women's archives, and saying, I'm writing about this and this person. Does anything ring a bell? Do you think you might have anything about this? And, hearing from them and saying, well, I don't know if we have it about that person, but here's someone who is a contemporary of hers that might help you get a sense of how these people lived and their surroundings, or, what they were reading. So it was like this long email dialogue version of research, unlike anything I had ever done before. I guess many people experienced during the pandemic a version of things they had never done before. And then the really fun part, after negotiating all of that and getting a lot of scans that were hard to decipher, was moving into the periods of time where I could actually talk to some of the activists who were involved in these movements. The feeling of tracking down, the youth secretary who was Rosa Parks's assistant on the NAACP Youth Council at the time of the Montgomery bus boycott, and having her say, sure, I'd be happy to talk to you about that and tell you about, Miss Parks. That was just an absolute thrill. And as we moved through civil rights and second wave feminism, those kinds of interactions became increasingly possible.
Wow, that's really interesting to hear about the collaboration and the almost serendipity behind this research process.
Yeah, no, truly endless gratitude to those wonderful librarians.
Definitely. Librarians are the true heroes, and it's great to shout them out. So before you wrote this book, you have a long, impressive resume of writing for women's magazines. And I'm wondering if you can talk about your experience and perspective as a writer for women's magazine and how that influenced how you wrote the book.
Oh my God, such a good question. Well, I've been thinking about this a lot actually this week, because thank you for the introduction, Judith, but I had started at Elle and I worked at Glamour, and I profiled all kinds of people, especially women, in those roles. And one of the people that I profiled in 2021 was Dr. Kathleen Carrico, who won the Nobel Prize this week for her pioneering work on mRNA research that sort of formed the scientific basis for the COVID vaccines. And I published that story in 2021 on the heels of the vaccine, becoming widely available. And I loved meeting her. I was absolutely astounded by her story. immigrant who had been kind of bounced around from department to department, just the kind of story of underestimation that we in women's media love to tell. And the profile got, a bit of a resurgence this week after the Nobel Prize was announced. And of course, as always happens in these cases, I got very well-intentioned messages from a few women and many men saying, wow, I never expected to read a story like this in Glamour, which they always mean as a compliment, and which I take as a pretty significant insult, because I loved coming up in women's magazines. I loved telling stories that quote unquote general interest magazines didn't think were important for a long time before it was front page news. If you wanted to read about, the patchwork abortion laws in this country, if you wanted to read about maternal mortality, you were reading about it in places like Elle and Glamour, because it just wasn't considered front page news. I would say places like GQ and Esquire should be covering that with just as much intensity, but they don't. And I love those people, but it's the reality. So I always felt a sense from other people that when I started publishing more broadly, that there was like this feeling of graduation, that I had started in women's magazines and now I could publish in the New York Times. But some of the best, most nuanced stories I've ever written, I think, still appear in women's media. I'm a big defender of it. I think it has a place and deserves to exist. And yeah, you will always hear an earful from me if you tell me that you can't believe a good profile ran in a place like Elle or Glamour. The magazines are full of them.
Thank you. Thank you. Speaking of women's media, I'd love to dive into your first chapter where you profile the Lowel Mills girls, which people may have heard of because they're famous for their self-organized strike, but people might not know about their internal monthly periodical, The Offering, which was the United States' first ever magazine with an all-female staff. And of course, the Rising Voices Fellowship, which I manage, is focused on writing as a tool for social change. So I'm wondering if you can talk about this pioneering publication by girls for girls.
Yes, perfect slogan for the Lowell Offering. I wanted to include the Lowell Mill Girls before I knew about the Lowell Offering, and my zeal and delight to discover this magazine was considerable. One of the things I love about it is, I don't know how many people who are on this webinar now have ever kind of observed some of the rituals of internet writing. One of the popular ones is this idea of a food diary or a money diary, where on the internet somewhere, on all kinds of websites, including women's media websites like Refinery 29, someone charts something for a week. They chart their fitness routine or what they're eating, and money diaries is a big one. They explain what they spent on which thing. Imagine my utter surprise to find in the Lowell Offering in the 1830s, a version of money diaries, literally a girl asking her fellow mill girls how she was going to spend the $2 she got in wages every single week. It was just like such a reminder that the more things change, the more they stay the same. And also that we've always had kind of a voyeuristic interest in how other people spend their money. But that aside, what I loved about The Offering is that you would see a lot of what I loved about writing for women's magazines, which is right next to some, daydreaming poem about a crush someone has or about a beautiful day in nature. There's this full-throated endorsement of, better wages for workers, better rights, better living conditions, or a list of the books that you can take out of the library in some of the houses where these mill workers are living. I don't know if everyone knows about the mill girls, but basically in the 1830s, these textile mills opened all up and down the Northeast coast, and they were staffed by girls who had until that point no real reason to ever associate with each other in any kind of large scale way. High school was not a given at the time, and these were girls who mostly would have moved from the family farms where they lived into their husbands' homes. And so the mills, for all their faults, become this kind of strange internship, apprenticeship, where girls are living together, working together, writing basically this zine together, earning money and thinking about their futures. And you see that jumble reflected so cleanly in the magazine, where all these things coexist and live side by side. And I love the idea that in their little extracurricular time, what they wanted was to record their experiences. In the prospectus of the magazine, which I quote in the book, which I think about a lot as something that was one of the reasons I wanted to focus on girls. The girls say, other countries have their ancient traditions. Egypt has the pyramids, and other countries have gems that are, buried deep. And America is going to say, we had our girls. These were our jewels. And I love the idea that they had that opinion of themselves, because the world certainly did not.
That's fascinating. In the book, you talk a lot about the experience of girlhood and the activism that girls were able to do. And some people were able to continue this activism into adulthood and some were not. So two of the girls you profile are Anna Dickinson and Mabel Pinghua Lee, who were prominent speakers during the abolition and suffrage movements, respectively. But both of these women did not continue their activism into adulthood. So I'm wondering if you could talk about these figures more, and also this the transition between girlhood and adulthood.
Yeah. That was in sort of the first half of the book, kind of like an animating principle. Would it be possible even to remain an activist as an adult? So Anna Elizabeth Dickinson was born in Philadelphia, daughter of Quaker activists and abolitionists. She actually became the first woman ever to address the House of Representatives, which is just a fun fact about her. She was one of the highest paid and most lauded orators during the Civil War about abolition. And at this point, she's, 16, 17, 18, 19, sort of in that vicinity. And like you said, she gets older, and she sort of falls out of favor with the same people who had been employing her to go on these tours around the country. And she finds the transition to adulthood really, really hard. She thinks about maybe being an actress or a playwright, to go from basically being a celebrity to being a nobody is, I think we've seen it in our own culture in terms of how child stars grow up. It's not an easy road to go down. And for her, it was really challenging. She suffered mental health problems, probably addiction. And she sort of just fell into anonymity, really. She was friends with all the quote unquote right people, and she just couldn't translate that girlhood career into a sustainable adult existence. I think in part because she was so unprepared for how audiences turned on her. At one point, she's this girl that everyone is hanging on her every word. And then she becomes a woman and people think like, wow, she's a little hysterical. She's like a little dramatic. And she doesn't know how to navigate that. She doesn't really work towards the end of her life. And she certainly doesn't have, the big august third act that maybe some people might have hoped for her. And Mabel Pinghua Lee is a Chinese immigrant who becomes an avid speaker about suffrage, so charismatic that people say that when she gave talks, the audiences left, quote unquote, Mabelized by her talks because she was that good. And she gets a PhD in economics from Columbia, one of the first women, and certainly one of the first ever Chinese women to do that at a time of rampant discrimination. And tons of her friends think, she should maybe go back to China and run for office, since women were becoming increasingly enfranchised there, or maybe she'll continue down this road of suffrage in the US and become an even more prominent speaker. Obviously, some women in suffrage do become activists and remain activists throughout their lives. And instead, the depression hits and her father gets sick and dies. He had been a preacher with a church in Chinatown, and she just totally recedes from public life. And she takes over the church and is very involved in her community, but doesn't really have a public persona. That's one of the few places in the book where I feel like I show my hand more, because I so badly wanted her to have a different kind of life. It's like one of those moments where you're looking through the archive and you just wish you could red pen the whole thing and write a different ending for her. But there really is no indication that she wanted to do something else and was denied the opportunity. And so I think one of the things that I grapple with in the book is what do we want for girls and what do girls want for themselves? We should all be fighting for a world where a girl can choose a life of quiet anonymity if that's what she wants. It's just hard to believe in the 1920s and 30s that there really was a choice. And I think for me, Mabel and Anna's stories exemplify the fact that until really, with very few exceptions, until the civil rights movement and women's suffrage come along, the range of possibilities to just grow up and pursue a different kind of career are so narrow. And I write about the fact that I think girlhood exists in this strange middle ground for people where it's one of the last times and one of the first times where you see grown men listening to something that a woman has to say. And as soon as she hits kind of this critical age, they're not so keen on hearing from her anymore. And I think that you start to see many more girls grow up and remain activists as civil rights and second wave feminism comes along and makes that kind of thing possible.
Speaking of civil rights, but someone who maybe never even was lauded or appreciated even in her girlhood, you discuss Claudette Colvin in this book, who has been really forgotten, but now people are starting to discuss her as the Black girl who refused to give up her seat for a white person before her mentor Rosa Parks ever did. And you encourage us to tell Claudette Colvin's story, but at the same time, not demote Rosa Parks and the role she played as well. So can you explain this tension for us and how you chose to navigate it in the book?
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned that Rosa Parks was her mentor. I feel like as Claudette's story has gotten better known, Claudette, like you said, was a teenage girl who refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus, segregated bus in Alabama, 9 months before Rosa Parks. That story, people, I feel like it's starting to kind of penetrate the consciousness, but a lot of people don't know that that whole summer, so Claudette refuses to give up her seat in March, Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat in December. That whole spring and summer, Rosa Parks and Claudette Colvin are extremely close. They know each other so well. I write in the book that they know how the other person takes her coffee, which I think everyone knows is an intimate way of knowing somebody. Rosa Parks at the time was running the NAACP Youth Council, and she is hugely encouraging of Claudette and tells her to come to the meetings. She makes her repeat the story of getting arrested on this bus so many times that Claudette Colvin, in the manner of teenage girls everywhere, is like, stop making me tell that story. I'm tired of telling the story. And, you know, Claudette certainly felt that when Rosa Parks was arrested, that she was thinking of Claudette and remembering what had happened. A lot of people think that the reason Claudette didn't kick off the Montgomery bus boycott herself is because she was pregnant at the time of her arrest. That's not true. She did become pregnant later, but basically, you know, movement leaders were really casting around for the right person around whom to rally, and that person needed to be perfect. And the feeling was that Claudette, whose family was, you know, not from the most prestigious neighborhood, who was a high school student, wouldn't be able to take the kind of pressure that was coming for whoever the movement ended up rallying behind. Then she did that, you know, that summer and fall, it did become clear that she was pregnant, and she was certainly ostracized, but she wasn't pregnant at the time of her arrest. It was really, really hard for her. And I think anyone who history anoints or doesn't anoint in one way or another is going to feel a kind of way about the randomness sometimes of that process. And it both hurt and helped that she actually knew the person really well who ended up becoming the figurehead of this movement. The reason that I write in the book that I don't believe in this idea of, you know, singling out one person at the expense of another is I think any student of history knows it doesn't really go like that. Progress is something that builds on the past, and it isn't Rosa or Claudette. It's Rosa Parks knowing what Claudette had done. It's Rosa Parks having been a lifelong advocate of young people and of telling their stories. And I write in the book of truly having coming close to giving up her movement work were it not for her belief in the next generation. These figureheads, they don't just exist, you know, suspended in some like gel incubator. You know, they're always brushing up against each other, either in person, as Claudette and Rosa Parks did, or just in their theories and as their ideas evolve. So I'm a big fan of seeing history as a continuum in that way, and recognizing the ways that the people who come later take into account and sort of absorb the lessons of the people who come first. But yes, I think it is pretty revelatory that actually these two women are so much more connected than people realize.
Yeah, thank you for illuminating that, because I had heard this kind of correction of the history, but I didn't realize how they were actually closely working together. So that's quite interesting. And speaking of this kind of collaboration, the civil rights movement, you wrote something that I've never heard before. You said friendships between girls were the bedrock of the civil rights movement. So I'm wondering if you can tell us more about why you said this.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really hard to have a movement alone. Famously, pretty challenging to be one-on-one. And one thing that you see in the early civil rights movement is the movement is kind of coming to town. Actually, there's one of the activists who I talk about at length in the book, Bernice Johnson. She says that she was waiting for the movement to come, like almost the way you'd wait for a band to come on tour. That this feeling that something is happening, something is moving through the South, and she's waiting for it to come to where she is so that she can join. And some of these organizers with, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the NAACP, on the youth side of that equation, what they do is they find themselves over and over again. Their central recruiting grounds for these movements are the yards and playgrounds and fields outside of high schools, because high school girls are the early adopters in almost every single place that the movement ends up coming. And part of that is owed to the fact that it's always going to be harder for adults to join movements because they just have more to lose. And part of it was that girls liked joining the movement together. Entire friend groups decided, yes, we're going to march in this rally, or yes, we're going to support this person who's been arrested. We're all going to go to jail together. Yes, we're going to sing songs together. Yes, we're going to have sleepovers the night before these rallies. The whole infrastructure of friendship, the way if your friend is doing something, you want to do it too, helps the movement get really big, really fast. Now, of course, there were excellent organizers and strategists working on expanding the reach of the movement. But it was just so striking to me that in record after record, when I was reading about how young women found SNCC, the story was always a version of, well, I was talking to this friend of mine and she told me she had met this cool person who was doing this thing, the same way any trend, takes off in high school. And I just felt really strongly that were it not for friendship, the risk and the undertaking required by these activists just could not have been borne. It was because girls knew that they were in it with each other that made it possible to do things that are, kind of unthinkable in a vacuum. And I loved the image of these people coming to town and thinking like, well, where should we go to find people who might want to be part of this? And then thinking like, I need to find the cheerleaders, basically. And that's pretty much what happened.
Yes, it reminds me of the feminist mantra, the personal is political. This idea. Yeah, the personal friendships are a foundation that can be used for political movements. Speaking of groups of women doing political work, you also discussed the collective Jane in this book, which was a group who offered abortions in Chicago before Roe versus Wade. And they have, of course, this history has received new attention with the fall of Roe. Jane featured many Jewish women in their group, and JWA has made a podcast about it, which we'll put the link in the chat. But I had never seen Jane discussed as a youth movement. So I'm wondering why it was important for you to include this group in your book.
Yeah. So yes, Jane was made, the women who became Jane were mostly women in their 20s, 30s, 40s, and older. But it had its roots as a youth movement because Heather Tobis, later Heather Booth, who became the person who started Jane, was a kind of a graduate of Freedom Summer. Like many young feminist women, she had been heavily involved in civil rights movement and had asked herself the question of like, well, where do I see injustice in my own life? And for her, the answer was certainly in the treatment of women. So she was in Chicago at the time as a student, and she pulled on her movement contacts when she got there you go. JWA loves Heather Booth. That's what we love to see. I interviewed her for the book. She's excellent. Sorry, reading from the chat as we have this conversation. But she heard from a friend about someone who desperately needed an abortion and asked Heather, given that she was so well connected, if she knew a doctor who would do it. And because she had been so involved in the civil rights movement, she did know someone who she thought would do it. And he did do it for a price, but for a much more affordable price than raising a child that you don't want to have. And that got her started on this idea of like, oh, wow, women need access to people who can provide abortions, and sort of like in a Yenta-like fashion, she's trying to connect the people who need that service with the people who can provide it. And she doesn't at all. I mean, when I spoke to her about this and in the histories that she's done, she didn't mean to start something that would become Jane, but it's like, once one person hears you're the person to call if you need this, more people are going to call. And basically she helped found this infrastructure of Jane, of this kind of way station where if you need an abortion, you could call quote unquote Jane, and Jane would connect you to somebody who could provide the abortion. And then as time went on, the Janes taught themselves how to provide abortions. And that's, that is the version of the service that people know really well. That chapter, as you kind of mentioned, was when you write books, you're writing them months and months ahead of time. And the first version of that chapter was written in a world in which Roe was still the law of this land. And the final version of that chapter was written after Roe was overturned. And for my editor and for me, I think it was a painful reminder of how present a lot of this history is. We are not past, the times of these things.
Yeah, definitely. And in the book, you cover, of course, before and after, but a main focus is the 20th century. And this is really the century where the category of teenager is created. So I'm wondering if you can talk about how girls' activism was influenced and changed after adolescence was invented as this category.
Yeah, I mean, in the first version of the book, when I was thinking about it, I thought I would just start the book after teenager was already a thing, 1930s, 40s. That's when the term adolescence is coined in actually like 1901. But the idea, the category of the teenager is, like you said, it's an invention of mostly the post-war era and a little bit beforehand. And I thought, great, I'll start there, totally fine. And then I found so many stories of girls who thought of themselves as, not children, not adults, who existed in a category they didn't even have a name for. And I was like, okay, they've got to go in the book too. So then the book started a little bit earlier, but yes, teenagers come into their own once there is a category for them to belong to. And that is definitely something that happens with the rise of consumer culture, with like the advent of a certain kind of pop culture that teenagers are very much defining. And that is, the fun part about the book is the growing awareness among teenagers, as teenagers now, I'm sure, still believe, as I believed when I was a teenager, of a feeling of being all powerful. I mean, you are the culture to which pop culture is responding. And certainly the teenagers of the civil rights movement and later of second wave feminism and, the girl power era of the 90s, there's this sense of like, wow, we are really deciding what's in, what's trendy, and yet we are disenfranchised in all of these different ways. And so that tension, I think, is like the animating tension of the middle part of the book. How is it that you can be arbiters of cool, of culture, and yet have so few rights to call your own? And I think if you look around at the culture now, in after a summer of Beyonce and Barbie and Taylor Swift, you see that same thing play out again. Girls are defining billion-dollar industries, and yet we know that girls are suffering in ways that they haven't for a very long time. So I think that is something that is a big part of the book, but it's also one of those things that I'm still thinking about. And I still think is something that needs further investigation. How is it that girls are making so many cultural decisions for us, and yet they're very disrespected as a cohort?
Speaking of Taylor Swift, that reminds me of how many people are saying that Taylor Swift's new boyfriend, Travis Kelce, is, more famous or more important than her because he's an important figure in the NFL. But actually, the global female audience of Taylor Swift is much more.
I mean, I pity the person who makes that argument seriously. His career will end very quickly, no matter how good he does, and her career will last for decades.
Speaking of this kind of pop culture and girls' interest in music and literature and other creative industries, something you talk about in the book is how fashion is an important self-expression for teenage girls. And people here may have heard of Mary Beth Tinker, who you talk about in the book, and who fought for the right to wear armbands to protest the Vietnam War in her school. I'm wondering if you can talk about self-expression and fashion as political for teen girls.
Yeah, I mean, this is the stuff that gets complicated, right? It's how do you use a tool that's often being used against you? Fashion and appearance, those are things that feminist writers have written for a long time about how they're used to manipulate women and how it can be hard to use a tool of like the capitalist marketplace to affect social change. And yet we see over and over again that girls do it, and that it's one of their most powerful weapons in a culture that isn't readily, handing them a microphone. So Mary Beth Tinker, yes, we very much used her appearance and a version of an accessory, a black armband, to protest the Vietnam War. And then in turn, launched the case that would, allow for First Amendment rights for students in public schools. And that was something she had actually a very complicated relationship to. For a long time, she sort of disavowed that because, of course, she had worn the black armband not to assert her First Amendment rights, but to end the Vietnam War, which continued long after that protest. And I spoke to her for the book too, and she became increasingly proud of the fact that many teenagers across the country to this day tell her, I'm allowed to wear goth clothes. I'm a girl and I wear pants, even though the dress code encourages skirts. I do all these different things and express myself in these different ways because of what you did. I think self-expression is, in a lot of ways, one of the first testing grounds for young women and young people in general to use their voice, to see how people react to them, to kind of witness their power in a public space. And maybe it's my women's magazine bias, but I think it's hugely important. And I also think it's practice, right? It's like a way to say, okay, I'm going to try out being my truest self, and how can I represent that in public? And the hope is that in turn, if you're really thinking that through and you're thinking about how you want to communicate with your clothes and with your appearance, that is the beginning of having a public voice, which I just think is part of growing up, and is a really powerful way that activists have long communicated with their various publics.
So you've spoken to Heather Booth, you've spoken to Mary Beth Tinker. It seems like you conduct a lot of interesting interviews for this book. And I'm wondering if there's any tidbits that were covered in the interviews that didn't make it into the book that you could illuminate us on what was said.
Oh, well, there were, I still am waiting to get actually from one of the civil rights activists that I interviewed for the book. We have been going back and forth on this, who told me that she could find the name for me of Rosa Parks's favorite face cream that she used. I was like, okay, having come from Elle magazine, please tell me Rosa Parks's favorite moisturizer. So that is, if I ever get that will go in the paperback edition of the book. But I would say a lot of, and I find this to be true for this book and in the work that I do in magazines, those last 5 minutes of an interview where you're about to hang up the phone and you've kind of asked all your questions, sometimes that illuminates something that does go in the book or the article or, anything like that. But often what you end up talking about is, how did your life turn out? Or what did you think would be done by now that hasn't been accomplished? These, the regrets or the ambitions or the feeling of, wow, my life got so busy, I haven't thought about this time in a long time. The kind of like silences in history. I found myself having a lot of those conversations. The feeling that a lot of women had of, we wish that things were further along for our daughters, in the global sense, that we didn't think we would still be fighting for some of this stuff. Or it's so hard to look at, our hometown and see what it looks like now, a lot of pride, but also a feeling that there's a lot left to do. And that sensation, I didn't quote all of them, but that was something I tried to capture in the later chapters of the book. The sense that, the job's not done.
Speaking of issues where the job is not done, an issue that you discuss a lot in the book is climate change, which has been very important to our Rising Voices fellows. And a lot of them have been involved in strikes and walkouts and activism around that issue. You profile climate activists from Nessa Rabin to Greta Thunberg, and I'm wondering why this issue has been particularly important to girl activists and how have they been effective in fighting for it?
Yeah, this is one of the issues that kind of launched the whole book. I was profiling Greta Thunberg in 2018 for Glamour. I think it was 2018. Fact check myself. And I talked to I knew that the movement that she was leading had students in all these different countries who were also doing the equivalent sort of strikes and activism and organizing in their own home countries. So I thought I'll reach out to other student leaders of these movements. And I actually had not intended to only talk to young women, but over and over again, in Belgium, in Germany, in countries all across Africa, the people who were leading the student movement were overwhelmingly, almost to a person at the time, girls, which I thought was so curious. Like, why would that be the case? And I asked one of them, why do you think girls are so overrepresented in the leadership ranks of these organizations? Because of course, I'm writing this 2 years after a woman doesn't get elected president in the United States. And I'm thinking, like, how is this leadership core developing? And one of the things that she said was, first of all, that climate in particular requires, working on climate requires a vision of consuming less and of collaborating more. And that she thought that was inherently something that people who are socialized as girls grasp. And have been made to grasp, because of the ways that girls are raised in the US and around the world. And I thought that was super interesting. And then she also said that talking about climate change was really emotional, and it required a certain level of being comfortable, being vulnerable, and admitting that something is gravely wrong. And that too, she thought, was something that girls were readier to take a stand on. She said tons of boys have joined, but that feeling of taking the risk and putting yourself out there and being vulnerable in that way was something girls were better at. And it just stuck with me. I mean, this was just at the beginning of thinking about this idea for the book, but it really stayed with me. I think, and I write this in the book, and I think it serves us all to be clear about this. I don't think that girls are somehow better activists than boys, or that boys can't be passionate about a lot of these same issues. But I think that the culture in which we raise girls teaches them some of these ways of communicating that have just turned them into really, really good activists. And I think climate is one of the ways that you see some of those skills on view the most.
Another topic that's relevant to today's young women is social media and how to use it for activism. And I'm wondering, as someone who works in media, what have you seen that has been effective with social media for girls today, and what are the challenges?
Yeah, I think one of the things that, and I think this is a lesson for all organizers, one that probably adult organizers know better, is that social media is an incredible tool for raising awareness, but it works best. And I think for a lot of the girls in the book, it works best when it becomes a tool to then connect people in real life. A virtual march so far is never going to pack the same punch as, a march that is shutting down a bridge in a major American city. Seeing people gather in the streets is, first of all, still visually so powerful. And I also think in-person organizing is what helps stave off the loneliness that can come with being an activist. So I think a lot of the girls I spoke to who do work in digital media and who do work to raise awareness on social media still want to be sitting in a room with their peers, hashing out how to proceed on one issue or another. So where I see social media working best is as a conduit toward in-person organizing, as a way of letting people know we're doing this thing, and not as an end unto itself. Because I think that we all know, if you've read any headline about the way social media is used, and particularly about how girls are using it, you know that as an end unto itself, it has done a lot of harm, even as it's done a lot of good.
I'm also wondering, as feminists, we talk a lot about a usable past, and especially at the Jewish Women's Archive, how we can learn about women in history and use that to inspire our own lives and our own activism. And I'm wondering if you thought about how this book can be a usable past for girls today.
Oh my God, I hope so. I mean, that would be like that would be the highest calling that this book could possibly have. I think one of the things that happens, and I think your point is so well taken, is that a lot of activists come to their work and they feel this pressure of, like, I'm the first person who's ever thought of this, and so I'm going to have to fix this entire thing myself. And of course, in the process of learning about movements, you realize many people have recognized some of these same issues, maybe in slightly different ways, and that everything that you contribute is building on, like you said, this past archive, really, of work that's been done and issues that have been thought through. I love telling the story of Bernice Johnson, who came in part to her activism because when she was a child, she watched the woman that she hoped would be the first Black woman to graduate from the University of Alabama enroll be accidentally admitted because they didn't realize she was Black, be expelled, bring a lawsuit with the help of a young, promising lawyer named Thurgood Marshall, who would, of course, go on to even greater heights, and then basically accept her expulsion. She got married, she settled down, and Bernice Johnson writes that she was just so devastated. She had been, as she says, pulling for this woman, like she had hoped to see her break this barrier. And she had a lot of resentment when she started in the movement of like, we should be farther along by now. If our mothers and our grandmothers had fought more, we wouldn't have to do this kind of thing. And that was the vantage point of being young and full of conviction. And the older she got, the more she realized that, that woman had done what she could do. She bore as much as she could bear. And that's what everybody does. And that's the responsibility that you have to the future. So I absolutely hope this book is read as that and proves to girls that they are drawing on this incredible legacy of women urging them on, but also that whatever they're doing is going to be a usable past for the people who come next.
And given that you've conducted a lot of interviews and wrote a lot of articles for various publications, I'm wondering why it felt important to write this as a book and what the book format lends to the story.
Oh God, it really helps not to know when you're going into it, like how much harder it's going to be than writing an article. I was like, I've written stories. How bad could it be? So at first I thought, I just thought like, this is a lot of material for an article. So it's going to have to exist at length. And then I thought, it'll just feel like writing a bunch of articles. Definitely does not feel like that. Feels way harder. But I wanted it to be something that people could pick off a shelf. I have written for the internet long enough to see stories I've written disappear because of some CMS change or some website goes off. The internet feels like it's forever, but it's not the most stable archive. And I liked the idea of being able to say, there are 10 trillion books about wars and military formations, which, as I like to now say, is a version of boys' history. And I wanted to just provide as a counterweight one book to sit on the shelves as a version of girls' history. Many, many well-meaning fathers say to me, I'm going to buy this book for my daughter. I'm going to buy this book for my niece. And I always say, this is a book of American history and you can read it too. You're allowed to know as a man what girls have contributed to the liberties and the social progress that you enjoy. And so I wanted it to exist as a book for that reason too, to say this is really a book for everybody. Yes, even if it's not about the Roman Empire.
That's great. I see a question from Linda Mordell in the chat. So you've spoken to a lot of the younger activists you profiled. She's wondering, have you spoken to any or met any of the older feminist activists like Gloria Steinem?
I have met Gloria Steinem before, a privilege of a lifetime. And Gloria Steinem appears as a young woman in the book. That's the nice thing about having been a young woman activist. One hopes that you can grow into being an older woman activist. So one of Gloria's first appearances in the book is because she writes an article for Esquire of all places about the changing face of sexuality among and sexual activity among women on campuses after the advent of the pill. And she kind of goes and explores what's happening with young women who are emancipated in this new way, in this new era. And so, she appears as a young woman activist in the book. And yes, I have met her. And it was one of the amazing things about writing this for both the civil rights and women's suffrage, and not suffrage, and second wave feminism sections of the book, was that I could ask older women activists about what it had been like to be young women activists. And that perspective and vantage point was so valuable.
You illustrate in the book how the nature of girlhood is always changing and our ideas about gender are always changing. And something that's relevant to a lot of young women today and young people is this more expansive idea of gender. I'm wondering if in the interviews you conducted with the contemporary young activists, what they talked about, like what girlhood means to them and how gender has evolved in that way.
Yeah, I mean, one of the one of the visions that I had of the kind of girls that I wanted to include in the book were girls for whom their girlhood motivated their activism. And that was just as true for young trans activists that I spoke to who appear in the last chapter of the book. For them, their girlhood is very much what they are fighting for. So many of the girls that are in this book, from young Black girls in the civil rights movement on, we're fighting for just the right to be recognized as girls and as children and as equal participants in society who want to take part in this more equitable future. First of all, young trans girls are certainly doing that. I think we've all seen that over the past few months and year in really painful ways. And I think that, people who don't fall cleanly onto a gender binary are doing that too. They're also advocating for their childhood and for the right to be fully themselves. I was particularly interested in girlhood because of some of these historical precedents that I felt girls set. But I absolutely believe that the act of testifying to your rights as a young person is a universal and can be and should be a universal expression of what you hope to achieve. And I definitely think these categories are are changing and adapting to suit our modern understanding of gender in a way that the Lowell Mill girls were not thinking about. And a lot of people ask me, because this book is focused on the US, whether I'll ever write a book about other countries or, other or young male activists. I want all those books to exist. I don't necessarily think I'm the right person for them, but it was certainly important to me to include trans activists in the story because I think you can so clearly see some of the same things that are motivating girls in the 1900s to use their girlhood to testify to their right to certain liberties. You can see that happening the same way today with young trans girls.
Yeah, thank you. That's really powerful. In this book, you also quoted a contemporary young activist named Moctezuma Esparza, a teen who organized walkouts against gun violence. And she reflected on how the walkouts demonstrated, quote, what could happen and what needs to be done, end quote, even though they weren't entirely successful politically in their goals. And you wrote about this quote, let that be an invitation. The work is not complete. Which reminded me of the oft-quoted phrase from Pirkei Avot, which we say a lot in Jewish social justice circles, and is often translated as, you are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to desist from it. And I'm wondering, however we phrase it, what work is most important to teenage girls today, and how do we best support them?
Wow, what a good question. I think that for girls today, a lot of the questions are existential. Climate comes up almost in every conversation that I have, including with people who are organizing around racial justice. Climate is still in the background of that conversation, or people who are organizing around reproductive rights. The sense of like this turning point and maybe even a tipping point in our culture about what will be possible and the kind of liberties that we can have in the planet that we can have them on is very much top of mind for girls. I think the best way that I know how to support girls is just to ask them, like, what is on your mind and how can I be helpful? I think that sometimes it is that simple. Not every girl is looking to save the world. Some are just trying to make tampons and pads free in their high school, and I think, great, do that. And let them be the leaders of the conversation around what they need in their own lives. Certainly, though, in America right now, it is in almost every conversation that I've had since the book came out and in the final stages of researching the book, definitely climate was a big one. And I think that abortion rights now have become an increasingly big issue and something that, young women are thinking about and talking about. I did a story for the Washington Post last December around girls on college campuses and in high schools organizing around one-to-one models of distributing emergency contraception. It was just a way that a lot of people felt like they could do something tangible in the face of these problems that feel too big for any one person to take on. So I think however you can help make progress feel tangible for young women who need that, that's a very good place to start.
Are there any places in particular we should be looking or reading or following to hear these voices?
I mean, I would say social media is a place where a lot of girls are being heard. I honestly would start by just like looking up what's happening in your own zip code, in your own community. Are there girls or young people who are petitioning your local school board over something? Is there a community garden where young people have, are doing some kind of work? Is there something happening super local? Because if everybody did that, we would have much richer communities and we would know our neighbors better. And I think that can be a place to look. But yeah, if you take one sort of twirl down TikTok, you will definitely find girls doing very impressive things.
Thank you. That's great advice and a great call to action. And I see we're at 8:59. So unfortunately, that's all the time we have today. Thank you so much for being with us, Mattie. This was a perfect theme for kicking off the year celebrating our young feminist leaders, the Rising Voices Fellowship. And there's a lot more to discover on our site. So we're going to drop some links for you. You can learn more about Heather Booth on our site. You can listen to our podcast episode on the Jane Collective. You can learn more about some young Jewish women activists like Clara Lemlich and Naomi Wadler, who were both mentioned in this book, and also people that weren't in the book like Pauline Newman. And a very exciting initiative just launched this week is our online portal to our oral history collection, which includes more than 300 interviews, some with young girl activists like Rebecca Chernin and Shulamit Eisen. And of course, the new blog posts from the current cohort of Rising Voices Fellows will be posted in the next 2 weeks. So please follow our blog there and check out those blog posts, which will be up soon. And we are also publishing a series of interviews with alums of the fellowship from the past 10 years. Our next book talk will be on Thursday, October 19th at 8 p.m. Eastern with Marjorie Ingle about her book, Sorry, 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 The Case for Good Apologies. We hope to see you all then. In the meantime, wishing you a Chag Sameach. And thanks again, Mattie.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone. This was so lovely. And thank you for organizing and asking such good questions.
My pleasure.